Welcome back to another edition of Book Talk with Jordan Stefan. Welcome back to Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. We are continuing our ongoing discussion of Deathbird Stories by Harlan Ellison. If you are just coming to this discussion now, I recommend you go back to part 1 for my lengthy introduction on the book and on Harlan Ellison. It will make a lot of our discussion make a lot more sense. In any event, let's get right to it. Let's get into Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. Now, this is one that was kind of a personal favorite of mine, just because after I read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, I read Harlan Ellison's entry in John Clute's Science Fiction Encyclopedia, the Illustrated Science Fiction Encyclopedia, and he wrote a beautiful discussion of, or a beautiful write-up on Harlan's work, and one of the stories he recommended was Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. So that story, when I first got this book as a kid, got Deathbird Stories, I went right to this story first. And it is a interesting story. It's we were discussing it earlier, Stefan. It's a very Twilight Zone kind of thing, and it's about a man who is playing a slot machine and starts winning the jackpot every single time. And he starts to get the idea that the slot machine may be sentient and may be falling in love with him. So what do you think, Stefan?
Well, yeah, it is very similar to an Hour Limits episode. It's very similar to the previous one, Oh Ye of Little Faith. It has that same vibe. It has some interesting techniques, like a stream of consciousness, to represent this talking machine. And it does end in a very similar way of an Outer Limits episode, where it's like there should be a little mystical sort of wisdom at the end. The voiceover on the guy will say, "Oh, this is what life is, what for these people," or whatever the saying is at the end. So it's very clear, it's very simple, and these are one of the better stories because it deals with this kind of scenario, which is probably impossible. Like, you can't win this many times in a slot machine. And the other thing it does is it showcases another female role as seductress, or as most of his stories have, the female conning or trying to get a male to do something for them. So it's a very simple story in that regard, and because of that, it's very clear, and that's why I like it so much.
Right, and it points to its talking about the manipulation. It's what happens in this story reminded me on a structural level of the movie Ex Machina. If you haven't seen that, or have seen that, the idea of kind of being manipulated with love and that sort of thing. And I think this story cuts to the heart of something we've been talking about as we've been making this series, or as we've been making these book talks on Deathbird, and that is that when Ellison talks about worship, and he talks about worshiping the new gods, it's always in relation to playing into somebody's vices, into their shortcomings. That the gods are the new gods, or these cynical gods that kind of manifest over our shortcomings, our limitations, our problems, our vices, that kind of thing. And so I think it's a very interesting concept when we, it's kind of a post Judeo-Christian observation, where we think of the Judeo-Christian God as being, or at least the Christian God as being a God of mercy and salvation and redemption, and kind of pulling people out of their vices. Ellison takes a much more strident approach, and he argues that the gods we worship, the gods we want to worship, are the ones that are playing into our absolute worst nature. And this really taps into that. And these, the thing is, it's, yes, these are situations, and we'll get into a little bit more of this later in some of the other stories, but it's like, yeah, these are women that tend to take advantage of men, but there's kind of a cyclical thing to it too, that these men are usually grifters and con men and things like this. So there's like a balance point between, it's kind of like the women are almost seducing them the way they try to seduce the world, if that makes sense. So there's almost a taste of their own medicine element to it.
Yeah, it's a good, well-written story. I think pretty much all I have to say about that. And I mean, I'm going to say that a lot about these stories. Like, yep, this is good. Got to read it.
Well, the next one is called Corpse, and this is interesting because it's a fairly brief little story, and it's just about a guy who basically starts to wonder really if there is a god of cars, and it's almost like a more liturgical version of the Along the Scenic Route, where it deals with cars and automobiles, but it is just kind of almost a thought experiment, really. Yeah. It's like really just wondering, what if it's like, if there was a world like we see in Pixar's Cars, that kind of thing, like what kind of god would they worship? And it's not even about that, it's just about him kind of thinking about that. So it's a neat little idea, not a whole lot to say, but
right.
It happens.
Yeah.
But it's
When I first read it, I actually didn't like it that much. I thought there's really not much here. And then on reflection, you go through it, and you're like, this is actually pretty clever, because it goes through this person's day to day, and losing a job or whatever. And he's not a stupid fellow, but he has this belief, and he believes in whatever god he believes in. And this is kind of funny because the previous story was about luck, or the god of luck, or chance and what have you. And then he says, well, this. It's a crapshoot. You're playing the stock market. This is what do you put your faith in, and why do you do that, and what happens if you screw up, believing in the wrong force in the galaxy. Right. So it's sort of had to lend itself from the previous story, I think, for it to jive properly. Because when I first read it, I was like, this is not really doing anything for me at all. And but it really asks you, who are you praying to and why?
Yeah. Right, and it's really knowing that Ellison's writing from this atheistic perspective. It's really like he's really asking the question, like, what vices are you indulging, and can you risk indulging these vices, that kind of thing, and yeah, it's an interesting idea, and and I like it's funny, the motif of watching people dismantle a car comes up several times in these stories. I think that's interesting, and and kind of watching at a distance and empathizing with the car, because that comes up later and at the Mouse Circus and in some other places. And so that's an interesting idea, and it's one that Ellison has explored a lot, or has explored in other places. If you read his collection Minefields, which is where he went through and did he did short stories for all of these paintings by Jacek Jerka. One of them is about, someone being kind of transmuted into a car, becoming a car, reassembled, and, that kind of thing. And so there's something there. And Ellison, I know, is a car fanatic. He's a car collector. He's got I think it's like I don't know cars, so I can't really say, but he's got some like vintage cars and everything that he still drives to this day and all that. So cool. Well, the next one we get to, this one I think is going to have a little bit more discussion to it. Shattered Like a Glass Goblin. Now, this one, this is a personal favorite of mine. This is a gem for me, because when I read this as a kid, oh my God, it scared the living shit out of me. And it was one that really scared. It was still creepy today, even when I read it and knew everything that was going to happen. It was still creepy reading it in modern times. But man, it freaked me out when I was a kid. And this is a story. Well, I've been doing the first couple. Why don't you set this one up, Stefan?
All right. This is about a guy who comes back from, I believe, a tour duty or training at the military. I can't remember exactly what the scenario was, because it's not really about that. And he's looking for his girlfriend, and she realizes he's part of this sorority house or some sort of on-campus lodging. And there's just a bunch of drug addicts in this house, and that's pretty much the premise, or the rest of the story as it follows. And he's trying to, get her out, saying, "Hey, let's go do stuff. Let's go on with our life." And she's just staying there with all her drug friends. Mm-hmm. So it's. I thought it was like very bland actually, and then it gets really, really creepy really fast, mm-hmm. And then it just keeps going with that vibe. So when I first heard about this, or I first read this, I thought, okay, this is the weird story where just everyone dies, because you told me there's like this story or one story in this anthology where it's just a bunch of things dying, and you're like, okay, this doesn't sound like it. So, but I was feeling that's what's going to happen, and it ends up becoming this weird, almost Kafka, weird. How would you describe? I'm kind of say like what, without giving it away. What does having an obsession and being in a haze do to you and the people around you, and how does that make you think and feel about those who are also in the same haze? What do we see them as? How do they see us? It's very heavy on the symbolism in that regard, because there's very specific symbolism which is all over the place, and it's very disgusting and very gory. It's almost like a one of those Saturday night horror flicks that it's like, okay, this is like a B movie, but it's, there's some substance to it, I guess.
Yeah, and it, for me, I mean, it has a lot of that like Cronenberg body horror mutation element to it and everything. And I think it's funny. It was, it very much it deals with this is like a drugged out hippie commune that's kind of drifting over to the dark side. But it's not. It's funny. It's not really about the drug. You might a surface reading might say it's an anti-drugs novel or story. I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's more like this, these people, just the effect of becoming an incredibly insular world, walling yourself off from the world to the point that, and living a very parasitic existence, cut off from the rest of the world because they are on welfare and everything, and just living that existence and being intentionally cut off from the world and cutting yourself off from reality, and you start to cross over. You start to be unable to climb out of that or get out of that distorted reality. And so it's and I think it's it works for the reason a lot of horror works, which is that these guys I'm sorry, let me start that again. It works for the reason a lot of horror works, and that is that it takes a very strong metaphor and makes it literal. And that's when horror works. Just like with Kafka, with the metamorphosis. Feeling, this guy feels like feels like an insect, and he and so he is an insect in the story. And that's what makes horror work, when the metaphor is made literal.
Yeah, in this case, the character is, he still loves his girlfriend, and that's really the only motivation for him to stay and try and get her back and try to keep her and, take care of her. And he doesn't really care what happens. He's just trying to do that. Even up to the end, he's just trying to make sure she's okay. And he goes along with all her problems and everyone else's problems. And he sort of loses himself. But he still has that goal to want to be with her. So yeah, it's this sort of sad, dark horror story that it's there's not much there in terms of the message, but it's kind of like, okay, it's either two things, and you can pick on the surface one, or you could pick on the deeper meaning there, and it's very simple. I wouldn't say it's a very strong story in terms of what it's trying to tell you. But because it's so simple, it's like, okay, this is what's going on. And it does have that sort of that Saturday night horror story to it. That's like, oh, geez, this is kind of creepy. So that's essentially what it is. It's a horror flavor.
Absolutely. So getting to the next one, this is an interesting little story. It was interesting for me, and it's funny because it was not one I had really thought about much since originally reading it, but this is called Delusion for a Dragon Slayer. And what was interesting to me about this story, it follows a very similar premise to, if you've ever seen the movie Heavy Metal, there's the second sequence with John Candy doing the voice, where the little nerdy guy in his room is transformed into this muscular warrior and sent off to fight on a faraway planet and save the babes and all of that. It's sort of a similar thing to that. You have a guy that is killed by falling debris, and he wakes up on a Viking ship, and he's the captain of a Viking ship, and he is now this huge, muscular, blonde-haired, blue-eyed,
Adonis, pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, Adonis. And I remember one of the descriptions, he looks at a reflection of himself and thinks, no one can be this Aryan. And that and what he learns is that we all get the afterlife that we want, but we have to prove that we are worthy of it. And what's interesting, I don't want to give it away, but the point that's made, and it's told very blatantly in the narrative, almost in a Rod Serling kind of way that you almost want to say, submitted for your approval in the Twilight Zone, that kind of thing. You can almost hear that the way it's explained, but yeah, it's saying, okay, you're getting your heaven. Your heaven is, when you're dreaming. In the story they say, when you're dreaming, your dreams are. That's you creating the heaven that you want to live in. Your dreams, your imagination, that's your heaven. Now you have to go on kind of a quest to prove that you're worthy of it. And what happens is, we immediately, again, it's one of those things about what are our vices, what are our shortcomings, what are our failures, and are we really worshiping those things? And so it's a question of, like, if you succeed at getting your afterlife, your promised land that you want, if you succeed in getting your heaven that you want, what is going to be the what will be the implications of that? Is it really what you want, or is it just your unfulfilled desires? And are you just worshiping your unfulfilled desires, basically?
Yeah, and these desires showcase what kind of character the fellow is and what he is trying to do. And he doesn't really exactly know. It's kind of a juvenile fantasy that he's in. It feels very much like a pulp comic. Like I could probably read this in a few, 14 pages, maybe 20 pages, and it's like, okay, fine. It does feel like it's dragging on a lot because there's all this fantasy stuff happening. And it's this pretty strong symbol of, this is what you wanted. Are you sure this is what you're going for? And not understanding what it is when you receive that thing. So there's a lot of weird mystical stuff that's happening in the the Viking fantasy. Yep. And it wasn't very clear as to why it was or who it was and what was going on. And it's fascinating in that regard because you don't know where Ellison's going to take this story because it starts off so pulpy and simple. Like, okay, he goes into there. Oh, okay, he's getting transported to another world. That's just like his other story, O Ye of Little Faith. But now it's an actual fantasy. It's a good thing. So it's a good thing he goes to this spot. But it's pretty much the last thing he ever does. And it's simple. It's symbolic. It's a clear message. Like it's literally hand holding you the message.
And it does use, again, I don't want to give too much away, but it does use a trope that has been a subject of controversy in recent years, which is the damsel in distress. And I think it's interesting. It is interesting what that trope brings out in the character, and I'll leave it to the reader to fully encompass that.
This is probably the better, or if not the best version I've seen of that trope. I didn't even think of that trope when I was reading this. That's how good it was, because this is just a simple, like, this is saying this is a fantasy, okay? Don't worry about all this, like, come on, the guy's a blonde god, on a Viking ship. It's like, okay, we get it. What's going to happen? And then it's even more mystical and magical as it goes further. So, I didn't even think about patterns or anything like that. Once you start teleporting people to magical realms, you're like, okay, fine, we're in a magical place. Just let go, see what happens.
You kind of take the restraints off at that point. But there is some interesting observation, and it's really a parable about how, what we want, we assume that what we want is what's good for everybody, and good on the whole is good objectively, and that's often not the case, and that's what he's saying here, is that you can triumph, you can succeed in fulfilling your wildest dreams, but you have to think about the meaning of those dreams and why you're having those dreams. So it's pretty profound, some ideas, but you're right, it just really does hand you the morals, that, like, the moral of the story is, and gives it to you. So moving forward, this is another story that is just interesting very interesting to me. and this is called The Face of Helena Bernos. And I gave this book I was taking when I was a kid. I was taking a writing workshop in Oxford, Mississippi, and one of the professors there was Cynthia Shira, who is a writer of no small merit. And I was talking to her, and at the time I had just discovered Harlan Ellison, and I was completely obsessed and everything. And I gave her my copy of Deathbird Stories and suggested she read it. And obviously she didn't have time for all of it, but she read The Face of Helena Bernos. And I think it's very interesting that she read that one, and that she is as a female writer would read that, because there is this is very much a story about femininity and the corruptions of it, and the manipulations of it and that kind of thing. And in a way, I mean, it's funny. I'm like, it's that classic thing with so many stories. When you talk about gender relations, there's this weird balance point where it's like, is this a misogynistic rant against how horrible women can be, or is this a very pro-feminist deconstruction of gender normativity and that kind of thing? And knowing that Ellison's personal politics skew to the left, I would like to think that it's kind of the latter, but this story really goes back and forth. So why don't you set it up some, Stefan? See what you think.
Yeah, I wouldn't even go that far in terms of politics. Okay, this is a story about the most attractive woman in the city. She's very refined. She's absolutely gorgeous. She knows what to say. She knows how to influence people. And she has I don't know exactly what her job is, aside from being beautiful and people giving her things. She goes around. What is she exactly? Is she a model?
Well, that's what's implied, is that she's a fashion model or something.
Okay, She basically just walks around and meets people, and she seduces them, brings out the best in them, makes them entranced by her, whether it's an artist or a minister or a businessman. And then right when they're getting good or becoming more what they are, she then trounces on their hopes and says, nope, you gotta, this is all crap. You're no good at this. I didn't become attracted to you because of this. So she pretty much destroys the hearts of men. And this is the ultimate example of the female role that Harlan does in his stories, aside from O Ye of Little Faith, where it's women as seductress. And in her role, this story is just about her as seductress and destroying men's hearts. So it's kind of weird how it ended. I wasn't expecting that, but it feels like a Buffy episode. It feels like one of those strange, not necessarily Outer Limits, but something along those lines, because it's so adult. Yeah, and I could see a writer putting this into a primetime TV slot maybe 10, 20 years ago that would have worked just fine. And I'm sure there's lots of stories like that I'm not familiar with, where they do have a woman who's this supreme seductress and just starts trampling on people.
Yeah. Well, they exist and they're out there, but it's weird because it's hard to talk about the real meat of the story without discussing like the last page and a half, which is where the reveal is, and it's not even the reveal is very subtle. But I think what they're, if I had to really, without giving it away too much, establish a concept here or a message here, it's really about I don't want to say the commodification of beauty per se, but more like the idea that the idea of like how we construct an ideal, and what is an ideal, and what is, it really is in a way like, because she's so precisely created that she just speaks to all of the and note I said created, that she speaks to all of the most minute things that men want in women. and is using those things to destroy them. And it's really like an idea of kind of the corporate machine creating complacency in a way. And it's interesting. Like I said, it's so hard to explain it without discussing those last few paragraphs. But I think a reader would come away with that understanding.
One thing that was mentioned that we can talk about, where other gods are aware of this woman's creation, but they can't blame her because the fault lies in the men who actually fall for this and then denounce themselves or whatever. So that was a very specific line I remember, because it's like, okay, where is he going with this? What's the point of this? And so it's the same with another story later on we'll come to, not in this recording, but there's certain gods do not like certain things, or all gods do not like very specific things, but you cannot blame this sort of gorgeous woman for what she's doing. It's pretty much the men who have fallen for this and accept this, and then as a result of her influence, they decide to then react to that. So it does speak to what desire, and especially the male desire for women or sex or influence thereof, does to their minds. And why do they think this way? Why do they react this way? Why are they so? Why does love drive them to madness? Why does it destroy them? What's the point of that? How does that work? It doesn't really go and explain that. It just shows it. And this is, I can totally believe this, that this happened to these men, and they just accepted those dark sides of themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think again, when we're talking about, I think the message about, because so many of these stories in here are about relationships, romantic relationships, and idealization. And I think what this is saying is that when you have an idealized concept of what your ideal partner should be, it's not because of he's not saying it's because of your higher values or your philosophical higher ground per se. It's more because you're hoping that ideal, finding that ideal, can protect you from something within yourself. And what he's saying is that, no, it's only going to make you more vulnerable. It's only going to make you, as Ellison said in one interview, if you're my tool, I'm going to use you, and so that, and that's the thing. If you act like a tool, you get used. And that's, I think, really what he's saying, that, it's almost like that trying to find your ideal makes you weaker than if you can confront, if you can turn around and confront the darkness within you and kind of come out on the other side.
It is interesting because, again, the previous story dealt with the fantastical ideal, this where do I really want to do? If I could become anything, this is what I would do. In this case, this deals with the ultimate feminine ideal of the desires of men. So I like how those stories are slowly following each other with an idea with a certain different angle, and then he's running with that. It's actually pretty smart.
Well, that's actually true, and I think it's no accident that those two stories follow each other, because in Dragon Slayer, you've got Delusion for a Dragon Slayer, you've got the masculine ideal, and in the Face of Hellena Bernos, you've got the feminine ideal, and the inherent corruptions to those gender structures, And so, I think it's interesting, and again, that's the thing where I always say, I was saying earlier, that you have this weird balance point between, when you're creating art about gender relations, like there's this weird balance point between misogynist on the one hand and feminist on the other, or something. I say feminist loosely, just referring to progressive gender ideas, but it's this weird balance. I think, not to go off on a tangent, but there's a Takashi Miike film called Audition, which is absolutely fantastic. You've got to see it. But it's a horror movie about a film producer who's holding auditions for his next for a new wife. They think they're auditioning for a movie, but he's actually auditioning them to be his next wife. And of course, he gets involved with a woman that turns out to be psycho. And it's when that movie came out, a lot of critics saw it and said this is this very cynical, misogynistic interpretation of women and female behavior and all of this. And then there were other critics who said, oh, this is gender positive, female woman positive thing. She's striking back against the patriarchy and the male establishment and all that. And of course, Takashi Miike says, look, the movie's got no political or social message whatsoever. It's just a thriller. It's not, and no one will listen to him. But still, it's that same kind of fine line in how people read things. So, moving forward to Bleeding Stones. Now, contrary to what you might think, this is not about trying to pass a kidney stone. This is a story about there's a huge crowd gathered to see the Pope at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and huge crowd, and all of a sudden the gargoyles come to life and start swooping down and tearing everybody limb from limb, and they rip the whole scene asunder, and one of them hovers above people and shits on them, and his shit is acid, and it burns people, burns people to ash and everything, and they just completely massacre the entire crowd. Then they fly off to the Vatican, and that's where it leaves it. And there's really not a lot of substance. There's not a lot of really no deeper meaning at all. The closest thing I can find is to meaning is there's a little introduction paragraph. Ellison does these little intros to his stories, and this one says, "This is a funny story, honest to gods. If you don't think so, just consider how Jesus would freak if a Jesus freak handed him one of those dog-eared, fingerprinty handbills on Fifth Avenue." So, how would Jesus react if someone was proselytizing to him? I guess, if you were looking for a message, I guess you could say that it's criticizing the institution of Christianity and it's the money changers in the temple all over again, and and that sort of thing. I guess, but really, it's just a bloodbath, and then it's over.
This was a story that Jordan warned me of. What he said pretty much. I have really not much else to say. I actually had to stop reading because one paragraph says a gargoyle does this, the next paragraph a gargoyle does this, the next paragraph a gargoyle does this. This goes on for like 4 or 5 paragraphs, and I'm like, okay, yeah, we're done. So this is pretty much just Harlan's version of macabre comedy. That's it.
Yeah, it's literally almost a demented slapstick, Okay, so moving on to the last story of today's discussion, and okay, I'm going to try to. I'm not going to. Spoiler alert. We're going to talk about the whole thing because, okay, try to follow. Help me out here, Stefan. This is the one story in the whole collection I just don't get. Okay, so I say it's beautifully written. It's entertaining. It's beautifully written. And I emphasize again that Harlan Ellison is my favorite writer and will always be my favorite writer. But this story, okay, walk me through what. Let's walk through what happens here. It starts out with a black con man having sex with a fat white woman, and he scams her for $500 and skips town. He goes into a fine dining establishment on the outskirts of town. Meets a woman there who he thinks is going to be his next conquest. She takes him to a party at a nice mansion type place. He goes in, he's admiring all of the displays, and they have a large crucifix on the wall. Then they tell him that he can have the answer to any question he wants, and then they put up a menu of suggestions on a screen, and the one he picks is that he wants to know how the dinosaurs died, so they take him into a corridor where the wall, it does like a almost holodeck Star Trek thing, and he steps through the wall into this world where he gets to watch the dinosaurs being killed and how the dinosaurs died, and he comes back through the wall, and after he comes back through the wall, it's revealed that he said something inappropriate in the course of socializing at the party, so they make him leave. So he leaves with this woman, and they go get a hotel room and have sex, and he can't come. And when he's unable to come, he gets up and he goes and looks out the window, and there's a bunch of street thugs down on the ground, or down at the street level, and they're eating his car. And one woman there's a woman that's making love to the exhaust pipe, and then there's the rest of the people are pulling apart his car, and it's like got meat and blood and everything underneath it, and they're eating the car, and that's it.
Yeah, this is very similar to the previous one, how the previous story was all about just violence and just killing everyone. This one is like a step into madness, and it's kind of like reading Finnegan's Wake. You don't read Finnegan's Wake for the plot. You read it because it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And this is literally, I thought this was about a crazy person. Yeah. And there's really very little avenue to understand what exactly is the point of the story. Yeah. It is entertaining. Lots of things are happening. He's having all these questions and problems to overcome, and these things happen in the story. So it's fun in that regard, in much the same way you read Finnegan's Wake. It's just silly. Yeah. This is just, I guess, his version of Finnegan's Wake. It's small. It's weird, and it's crazy.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it's the only thread that I could draw on throughout is that he talks to his car, and it mentions in the narrative that the car is sentient. So he apparently knows that the car is real, or not real, that the car is organic or is living. But I just don't know what that means. That's like I don't get it, but. Like, it's like we were saying, it's like a kind of modern day Lewis Carroll kind of thing. It's fun, and enjoy it. But I don't get what it means or what he's trying to say with it. So that concludes the stories that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to do our follow-up final episode shortly, and that will be, the stories for that one will include The Place with No Name, Pain God, Ernest and the Machine God, Rock God, Adrift just off the islets of Langerhans, and finally the epic closer, the Deathbird. So, some good stuff there. And Stefan, I think you'll agree that it's the way this story, or the way this book works. Like the first 7 stories, which we did in the first installment, they really punch you in the guts and just beat the crap out of you. These middle stories are kind of more thoughtful, a more relaxed pace, and they're more about ideas and just discussions of ideas. And then these last 6 stories, this is where it really comes back with a lot more dark, heavy kind of stuff.
His style is again all over the place. His genre is all over. It's a smorgasbord. You're going to have all kinds of themes, all kinds of ideas. It really explodes in the last third. So yeah, it's gonna be great.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, good times. Thank you for listening, and we will pick this up in part 3.